So I've already introduced myself. I'm Dr. Katherine Severi, the Chief Executive at the Institute of Alcohol Studies. And I'd just like to thank all of the participants today for joining us for this really interesting seminar. And I'm very much looking forward to the question and answer session at the end. So many of you will be aware that alcohol is a major concern in terms of public health. Alcohol is one of the leading risk factors for death, disability and disease across the world. And indeed, there is no safe level of consumption, especially when it comes to cancer risk, which is something that the World Health Organization is very keen to communicate to members of the public, because as we know, awareness about the risks associated with drinking alcohol are very low. So health literacy in terms of alcohol's impacts rates are very low. Now, alcohol not only harms individual drinkers, it also causes harm to families, communities, and society at large. And indeed, the economic impacts of alcohol harm are substantial. In the UK, it's estimated that each year alcohol harm leads to a cost to society of between 21 and 52 billion pounds. Now, alcohol harm is too often concentrated in some of the most socially deprived groups, therefore exacerbating health inequalities. So we can see that both within the UK and around the world, alcohol harm can be seen as a barrier to development and sustainable development, and certainly an exacerbator of inequalities, health inequalities and social inequalities. But the good news is that policy solutions do exist to improve rates of alcohol harm. And the World Health Organization has identified a range of policy options with the three top, what they determine as best buy policies, which are restrictions on alcohol's price, availability, and promotion, as the three most cost-effective solutions that governments can adopt to reduce rates of harm. Now, whilst there's incredibly strong evidence that these measures are effective and cost effective, unfortunately, implementation of these best buy measures is pretty poor globally. So one of the things that public health actors and organisations such as the Institute of Alcohol Studies, working with other NGOs, work to try and build support for these policy measures so that we can get really effective policy in place to reduce the burden that alcohol places. So perhaps one of the questions we could be asking ourselves at today's event is, could increased awareness of alcohol's adverse impacts on the environment be just one other measure with which that we can try and build support for alcohol policy change that can reduce alcohol consumption and therefore improve public health and also improve environmental health? So in terms of food and drink production and why we're all here to discuss the environmental impacts, it's really interesting to know that food and drink production is actually responsible for 25% of all greenhouse gas emissions. But obviously the impact of the production of different food and drinks can vary quite considerably. So here we can see that in terms of greenhouse gases, per serving, beer produces slightly more greenhouse gas emissions than milk. So we know that many consumers are currently amending their consumption habits. So for example, reducing their consumption of meat and dairy products in an effort to lower their carbon footprint. So I think that a better understanding of how alcohol contributes to environmental damage could potentially alter consumption behaviours, producing gains for both public health and the environment. So the BBC currently has a really great climate change calculator, and I really encourage everybody to go on the website and take a look at this, where you can work out the environmental impacts of different food and drink patterns. So for example, here we can see that drinking a pint of beer each day produces the equivalent greenhouse gas emissions as driving a petrol car for 1,000 kilometres. And it also uses the same water as 54 showers lasting 8 minutes. So I would calculate that that would be just over one extra shower each week from drinking a pint of beer each day. So similarly, we can work out the contribution that, that wine make. So if we compare the effects of beer with wine, we can see that drinking a medium glass of wine each day produces just less than half the greenhouse gas emissions compared to beer. However, wine consumption does equate to significantly higher levels of water use, with about 1.5 extra showers lasting 8 minutes each week for one glass of wine each day. Okay, so sorry, I don't know why it's been awkward. Here we go. So the BBC Climate Change Calculator uses data from a 2018 report, which looks at reducing food's environmental impact. So this particular report, and I've got the references at the end of this presentation, provides some pretty top-line data about the impact of beer and wine. However, there's quite limited independent research that's up to date, which gives details of how the production and sale of all alcohol products may impact the environment. So we do have a really excellent report from 2004, which was produced for the UK Food Climate Research Network. And this provided a really great overview of the different ways in which alcohol production and consumption contributes to the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. And this report has identified these 5 categories for how that contribution is made. So my presentation now is going to provide an overview of each of these 5 aspects of the alcohol supply chain and how they impact the environment. And I'd like to say that many of these practices can be modified, and I think that Tom and Modi will be able to provide some more up-to-date examples of corporate behaviour and modifying some of these behaviours in their presentations. So if we look at farming, alcohol production uses a number of raw agricultural materials. So these range from barley, hops and other grains for beer and spirits, and grapevines for wine. So the farming of these crops has really intensified in recent decades as we've seen alcohol companies merge to create a small number of global mass producers of alcohol products. Now, certain crops can have more of a detrimental impact on the environment, on the local natural environments than others. For example, winter barley, which is used for beer production. So traditionally, barley for malting has come from the highest quality spring crops. However, recently we've seen quite a significant development in new winter barley varieties, for which farmers use almost double the number of pesticides. Now, these changes and the decreases in the planting of summer barley have been reportedly leading to quite damaged bird populations. And similarly, conventional hop farming uses quite a lot of pesticides too. And this has resulted in what the pressure group Sustain terms scorched earth farming methods. And this is when the ground between and beneath the hops is kept quite barren and dusty, and obviously damaging the local natural habitats for wildlife. Furthermore, regarding hops, the majority of hops are imported from the US of A. After being processed into pellets, which we can consider an energy intensive process. So overall, the data indicates that mass production of lager uses more nitrogen fertilizer than other crops. And the annual planting of these crops as well means that they're rather energy intensive. In comparison with vines, which are perennial plants, so they're not planted afresh annually, these do require less fertilizer than grains. However, they do have much greater water demands in order to flourish. So they've got higher irrigation needs. I think just one final thing to comment on farming is that we need to remember that the use of land is a relatively scarce resource in a time of global food shortages. So use of land for alcohol production may be displacing use for other essential products. So moving on to production, water use and waste. So the majority of processes used in the manufacturing of alcohol products are rather energy intensive. So these include mashing and crushing grains and grapes, boiling, fermenting, filtering, and keeping products at controlled temperatures. So larger companies can be more efficient in many of their processes, taking advantage of economies of scale. And I know that Tom will be able to give a lot more details about this in his presentation. However, the basic principle remains that alcohol production requires significant levels of energy. Moving on, water use is also an area of concern, and especially in many parts of the world where water scarcity is high. A report by our partners, Movendi International, states that to produce just 1 litre of beer requires nearly 300 litres of water, and that 1 litre of wine requires 870 litres of water. Now, some regions have seen disputes between local communities and the transnational alcohol companies due to the perceived prioritisation of alcohol production over and above the use of clean drinking water and sanitisation for citizens. And I know that this is something that Modi will be able to elaborate on further with some examples of such disputes in her presentation. Now, waste products from alcohol manufacturing can also have a detrimental effect on local environments. And we've seen reports of pollution contaminating local drinking sources, particularly in low-income countries such as Uganda. And finally, the bottling and the storage processes for a number of alcohol drinks, such as spirits and wine, can be energy intensive and essentially contribute to the overall carbon footprint of a product. So the production and transportation of alcohol packaging is a major contributor to carbon emissions. So beer can CO2 emissions in the UK in 2004 were estimated at nearly 350 tonnes. Now, glass bottle production for wine is similarly very important and accounts for between 14 and 46% of CO2 emissions per wine bottle. So it's making a substantial contribution to the CO2 emissions. So very interestingly, we've seen reports that New World wine bottles tend to be heavier than European bottles, and they obviously travel further, so accounting for greater level of emissions. In 2004, it was estimated that the total glass tonnage in the UK for beer and wine and spirits exceeded 1.4 million tonnes, with wine, as you can see here, taking the lion's share. Now, alcohol packaging has become a more significant contributor to environmental damage, given the shift from drinking in pubs with, the predominant product being drunk as keg or cask beer, to buying pre-packaged alcohol in supermarkets and shops to drink at home. So this is a real concern. In addition, given that recent estimates by the campaign group Sustain indicate that 50% of alcohol containers are not recycled in the UK, but are actually thrown into general waste bins. So alcohol products are very obviously heavy and bulky, and they often travel very long distances. So it was estimated that within the UK, the average different distances travelled by alcohol products can really vary, but with Scotch whisky travelling the furthest on average, which is probably unsurprising given that all Scotch distilleries are based in Scotland, and followed by wine, with beer travelling a shorter distance. However, with the emergence of global brands, overall, most products require longer transport distances. And this is especially true of New World wines and imported spirits, which are transported often in heavy glass bottles over long distances. So finally, I'd like to talk about refrigeration as a contributor to alcohol's greenhouse gas emissions. So this has become more important in recent years with the growth of home drinking and increases in domestic refrigeration appliances. So people are buying bigger fridges, some people are having separate wine fridges in their kitchens, but also the emergence of larger commercial refrigeration storage, largely seen due to the growth of ultra cold products like beers and coolers. But essentially, the popularity of products that are designed to be served chilled, such as beer, white wine, champagne, spirits, and premixed cocktails, these all have a larger carbon footprint than other alcohol products due to their refrigeration requirements. So in terms of my so what and concluding thoughts, based on the data available, I think that we can say it's clear that alcohol production and consumption can have a negative effect on the environment. But perhaps we need to be viewing this through the lens of the fact that alcohol is a discretionary, so it's a non-essential product. So a reduction in consumption would not only be good for public health, but also good for the planet. Now, the paper that the BBC used to inform its climate change calculator estimates that reduction of consumption of such discretionary products like alcohol, but also oil, sugar, and stimulants would have really significant impacts on land use, carbon emissions, and freshwater use in water-scarce regions. So I think collectively, people who are present today and interested in this topic, we need to think about how we can raise awareness of the environmental impact that alcohol has to build support for reductions in consumption, but also to build support amongst the public, partners, and policymakers for alcohol regulations that can reduce consumption and therefore improve public and planetary health. So here are the main references that I just used for that presentation. These slides will be circulated, so you'll be able to have access to these.
As Katherine mentioned, I work at the Wellcome Trust in the Climate Change and Health Programme, which sits in the research division. We have been working as a trust on climate change for about 5 years, for around 6 years, and have funded some of the research that Katherine was citing that underpinned the BBC calculator, for instance, the researchers involved in that. So I'm going to perhaps be taking a little bit of a bigger look at why is it that we as part of the wider global health community should care about climate change, and not just in terms of the direct impacts of alcohol on health, but then if we don't actually act on climate change, they're going to be wider impacts to us as society as a whole. And then talk about, from my experience of working in sustainable food systems, what kind of lessons might we apply to the alcohol sector. I'm not an expert in alcohol, but also I think discussions and debates around alcohol sustainability are quite new in the way that they are for foods, but I think food systems are a bit more advanced. So I will kick off with my presentation. So yeah, briefly, impacts of climate change, potential solutions, and then ending with some conclusions. So impacts of what are the impacts of global heating on health? We know that the world at the moment is already around 1 degree warmer than pre-industrial levels. The Paris climate targets are aiming for a 1.5 degree average global rise to be capped for the world. But in some regions, warming has already increased by around 2 degrees. And this exposure to high temperatures is leading to increased heat stress, morbidity, mortality from conditions like heart disease and strokes and other respiratory diseases. Since 1991, around 37% of warm season heat-related deaths were attributed to climate change, and linked with that, there's been increased mortality. This year, we have, and in the last few years, actually, we've seen a rise in heat waves as a result of the global warming that's already happened. For instance, in the summer of 19, France had a heat wave in which record temperatures were achieved of 46 degrees centigrade. That heat wave killed around 1,500 people. Half of those who died were over age 75. It also affected the very young. And then 10 people died at work. So there's also an occupational exposure risk from climate change. During hot periods, in particular, many schools and public events are also closed, with wider impacts on society as a result of the climate change. Another area where climate change is having an impact is on famines. So at the moment, Madagascar is in the midst of a drought-induced famine. Around 30,000 people are experiencing severe food insecurity because they haven't had rainfall for a long time. Families have been living on things like cactus leaves and locusts because they don't have access to food anymore. Water management and distribution is a key solution for managing drought-induced crop failure. But if that water is then being used to produce perhaps products that aren't essential for people's survival, like alcohol, then that kind of introduces tensions in the system around where the water should be prioritized for. Is it basic human survival or discretionary things that might make life better for a small proportion of the world's population. There's also competition for other users, and actually, I've mentioned the last bullet around competition for water in different parts of the world. Another area where climate change is having an impact is reductions in fruit and vegetable yields. At the moment, 1.5 million deaths globally per year are due to low fruit vegetable consumption. We're all perhaps not eating enough fruit and veg across the world. And higher temperatures and drought caused by climate change are making things worse. So they're projected to be a reduction overall in vegetables that can be produced by climate change by 2050. And this will lead to 500,000 more deaths. There are mixed effects of climate change on fruit and vegetable production. The increase in CO2 might lead to increases in yields, particularly larger products, because carbon dioxide helps fruit and vegetables grow bigger and more quickly. But then these benefits are counteracted by the negative impacts of climate change around things like reduced water availability, the temperature rise, and ozone. They have detrimental impacts. And so the net impact of climate change on fruit and vegetable production is that there will be a reduction in availability. But changes to the way we farm can help us produce more healthy and nutritious foods, including through things like better irrigation methods, for instance, assuming the water might be available. The other areas are rising in infectious diseases. So malaria transmission around the world is increasing in regions, particularly in Africa and the Western Pacific, for instance. Changes to the climate have made malaria 38 to 50% times more likely, which has led to more people at risk, particularly those who live in highland areas, which were previously more cool and perhaps not suitable for mosquitoes that breed malaria to grow. Similarly, because of climate change, we are also seeing an increase in the reproduction of vectors that lead to infectious diseases, particularly mosquitoes that lead to things like dengue, Zika virus, chikungunya virus. So those vectors' reproductivity is increasing in places like America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Southern Asia. The other area where climate changes have an impact is on through floods, and particularly waterborne diseases. So an example was a few years ago, there was this cyclone Idai in Mozambique, which led to devastating flooding. And that climate change is leading to increased flooding. That's a kind of one of the classic symptoms, alongside irregular increased temperature rises and irregular extreme events and weather events. And particularly in countries where the infrastructure is poor, that flooding leads to increased risk of food and waterborne diseases like cholera and diarrhea as well. The floods are not just a problem for developing countries. This year, we all saw the devastation in Germany that resulted from the floods that took place earlier in the summer. In Germany, there was 2 months worth of rainfall fell in 2 days. And these kinds of extreme weather events are only forecast to increase because of climate change if we fail to address global warming. The floods in Germany led to extensive infrastructure damage to buildings, bridges, and roads and water pipes. It left thousands without access to drinking water, electricity, and gas. And also, some of the regions that were affected were wine-growing regions. So it's in the alcohol industry's interests, considering the impacts of climate change on things like growing the raw materials for alcohol production, like grapes, for them to actually take this seriously and think about making the sector more sustainable. Finally, the other areas around wildfires. Many regions are now facing more frequent and predictable large wildfires. For instance, like we have seen in Australia, California, for example, Greece as well. These wildfires include, in addition to destroying biodiversity and vegetation on the land, also leads to significant levels of air pollution, which then become a major public health concern. This air pollution has a variety of health effects on the body. including leading to increased risks of heart attacks, strokes, heart disease, lung cancer, chronic bronchitis, asthma, as well as affecting fetal birth weight and development in children. So on to what might be the potential solutions to help people shift towards more healthy and sustainable food and drink patterns. I will kick off with a caveat to say, as I mentioned before at the beginning, just to say that looking at sustainability issues is quite new. So the examples I'm providing here are really just to, facilitate discussion, and hopefully, it'd be lovely to hear all your views about some of these potential solutions, which we may or may not want to draw from other efforts to support public shifts. The first is looking at whether we might develop this true value of alcohol approach. So this year's UN Food Systems Summit, one of the consortiums that has arisen from it is coming up with this true value of food initiative. And the premise around that is that, like the food system, the global alcohol sector has many hidden costs, including high rates of acute and chronic health hazards. Perhaps they're not so hidden, but nevertheless, there's also things like impacts on the environment that Katherine talked about, unfair wages and working conditions for those working in the sector, which are not reflected in the profits that are made by the industry or the prices that people pay. Developing a true value of alcohol metric would help guide choices across policy, finance, businesses, to ensure that those externalities are actually reflected not just in the price, but also the policies that guide how the sector is regulated. And it would create better transparency around the costs and benefits. Benefits might include livelihoods for those who work in the sector, and ensure that they are appropriate incentives and disincentives are applied to ensure that the sector is as sustainable and promotes more fair and equitable outcomes across society. Then there's the question of environment labels and whether they would work for alcohol. At the moment, there are several eco-labeling schemes for food products that are in development in Europe. Two notable ones are EcoScore, which is led by a French collective, and it's based on a typical life cycle analysis of a product. So in general, wines, for instance, might have a different sort of environmental score compared to a different type of alcohol like beers. Some of the early adopters include Lidl and Scottish stores. Another scheme that's in development or in the early stages of development is led by a UK collective, the Foundation Earth scheme, and this allows for variation between alike products. So you would have, as Katherine was showing from her BBC slide earlier, that the environmental impacts of different products within categories can vary. You've got more environmentally friendly forms of meat versus and less environmentally friendly forms, likewise with alcohol. So this would perhaps allow a bit of differentiation with alike products within a category. And as a result, this scheme is more favorable to brands and is then supported by brands such as Nestle and M&S and Danone, who have supported it. Still early days to see which one is going to work better for consumers. Again, I think initially it's going to be focused more on food, but nevertheless, there could be some early adopters, or perhaps we could encourage some early adopters in the alcohol sector to join and pilot these schemes. An example of a company a drinks company that's decided to go ahead and start providing information on its environmental impact is Alvalin, a kind of ethical drinks company. And what they've started doing with this new scheme is displaying carbon emissions, water use, recycled material use, and charitable donations on their new label. You might query why charitable donations might be needed to be included on a label, and that links to some of the ethics around whether or not these labels might genuinely support shifts to sustainable, are intended to support shifts to more sustainable consumption patterns, or perhaps more of a promotional tool. So the way they provide the information is as a facts panel, as opposed to a traffic light label like some of the other ones out there. And certainly from our experience in food, environmental facts aren't necessarily as accessible to the general public as simple traffic light schemes. Nevertheless, the founder of this particular company has given his rationale for introducing the scheme, and it basically says that the spirits industry has a total lack of labeling transparency, which we all know, and brands are not even required to list ingredients, let alone ecological impact or nutritional impact. And they have decided to introduce this environmental impacts label because they want to change. They want to basically lead from the front and make sure that the environmental impact is very clear to the consumers who buy their products. There are some considerations, and I'm sure the next speaker is going to talk about some of these perhaps in a bit more detail around before developing labels. The standards and profiling underpinning the labels will be key, as we also learned that from the food system sector. And schemes will vary. There's a number of variables which may make the labels more robust or not. The data that they use to determine the environmental impact, some of them may go back to the data underpinning the raw materials, others may not decide to do that. Packaging, some take into considering the packaging, things like the size, whether the packaging that's used is recyclable, others don't. Then also there's the potential impacts on biodiversity and endangered species, which aren't necessarily always taken into consideration. Some of these things are difficult to measure, but nevertheless, that shouldn't be a barrier to us actually ensuring that the research is there to provide the data if we think this is important. And then finally, the social impacts are also often neglected in terms of whether the workers are paid well, what the working conditions for them might be. Things that you might expect to see on a fair trade label aren't necessarily included. So then there is also just a broader risk around who is leading the development of the scheme. Certainly we learned from food that the industry-led schemes, when individual supermarkets, for instance, developed their own schemes, they tended to have weaker criteria. So for instance, the sugar cutoffs are often twice as high for industry-led schemes compared to those which are developed by independent public health bodies. There is good news in the sustainable labelling space in that both the UK and European Commission are currently considering the development of sustainable food labels. A bill is currently passing through Parliament in the UK, whilst the Commission is considering having a framework developed for adoption in 2024. Again, these policies are primarily focused on food, continuing with this perennial exclusion of alcohol from a requirement of clear labelling in the way that food currently is required on food. Do eco-labels work? A systematic review we supported by Potter et al. At the University of Oxford looked at 56 studies which tested the effects of eco-labels on consumer food and drink purchases. They included a variety of labelling messages on their products, from those that perhaps were organic labels, low carbon, to pesticide free. And they generally found that products with eco-labels led to consumers to choose those products in 79% of experiments compared to those without. So in general, eco-labels lead consumers to choose those products, which can be a good thing from a sustainability perspective. And they were also tended to be more effective amongst women who perhaps seem to be, certainly in the studies looked at, more interested in the sustainability dimensions of food and drinks. So what are the other potential solutions could we perhaps explore? And I've just listed a few examples here from the Healthy Food, Healthy Planet initiative, which we've been supporting together with a few other funders in Europe, which is really looking at how we can support a shift to sustainable food systems, but with a particular focus on reducing animal source food products. But the sorts of measures we've been thinking about to support a shift by industry actors are things like industry benchmarks, which might name and praise or shame the good and the bad companies or the good and the bad products. Things like investor activism, so getting investors to only invest in more sustainable companies, and that again needs to be verified independently. Or then there's the usual marketing restrictions on the unsustainable and unhealthy products. And in order to have these kinds of policies, you would need some way of actually assessing the true value of the product to society, coming back to that true value benchmark I mentioned earlier, which takes into considering not just the environmental impacts, but also the potential health and social impacts animal workers, the impacts of the sector on the workers involved in the system, for instance. There are challenges in terms of the transfer or applicability of solutions from the food sector to alcohol, because certainly, as Katherine mentioned, whilst food is essential for life, alcohol isn't. So there are slight differences there. So the conclusions, I would say, are climate change, first of all, is already happening today and is posing significant challenges to health globally. So everyone has a role, including the alcohol sector. Consumers can also have a role in terms of which products they choose. This area is, however, is relatively new, and potential solutions will need to be underpinned by robust data, research and evidence to really work out what are the best solutions and approaches, what might be the intended or unintended consequences of going down a particular course of action. And therefore, yeah, we'll need to kind of monitor and evaluate solutions for these consequences.
Yeah, it's obviously a hot topic at the moment in terms of, climate change and efforts to try and reduce global greenhouse gas emissions with COP26 taking place this week. So I've been asked to give a quick presentation on efforts to reduce carbon, specifically in the drink sector, the alcohol sector, that we work with many of those clients in that sector as well. So I'll be basically talking through what companies are doing, what they should be doing, and I hope to sort of cover some of the ground similar to the previous speakers. I think we've heard initially about the key impacts across the value chain from alcohol, and then our latest speaker in terms of some of the climate change impacts on health. And then specifically alcohol impacts as well. So I hope to follow on from that, sort of talk about, what is happening in terms of carbon reduction in the sector and some of the clients we've been working with. So for those of you who don't know Carbon Trust, I'll do a quick introduction. We were founded back in 2001. We're an independent company, and we're mission driven. So our mission here is to accelerate the move to a decarbonised future. And we do that by working with governments, with businesses around the world to help them understand their climate change impacts and understand how they can transition to a decarbonised future. What are the key aspects to their current, in case of businesses, current business models that drive greenhouse gas emissions, and what might they do to transition their businesses to lower those emissions. So in terms of Carbon Trust as an organization, we basically work with those organizations around the world. So our main role and focus at the moment is to accelerate the move to a net zero economy. So we've been working, as I said, since 2001, so over 20 years of experience working with different stakeholders globally. We've got a team of about 300 staff from a range of different disciplines, from environmental sciences, business management, to engineering. And we use those disciplines in terms of engaging with clients around the world from the different offices we work from. So when we talk about sort of the challenge of climate change, and particularly net zero, it's quite useful to sort of think about the context of where we are globally at the moment. A lot of the corporate ambition around climate change has been pinned back to 2015 and the Paris COP21 agreement. It was reached back there, commonly known as the Paris Agreement. That's an agreement globally to try and limit global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade, and to pursue limits to limit that warming to 1.5 degrees. And so this limiting of warming is essentially limiting global warming above average temperature globally above pre-industrial levels. And then more recently, back in 2018, we had a report from the IPCC talking about the significant dangers of the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees world. So essentially what that was doing is looking at the very, very real climate change impacts. And the previous speaker has touched on many of those. So I won't dwell on too many of these aspects here, but that sort of really galvanized focus to look at that. And the key aspect around Paris and this 2018 report has been to consider the fact that all of the agreements that were put in place in Paris, there's obviously a gap between where the world needs to get to in terms of carbon reduction and the current policy pledges. And there's still this gap. We look at the current policy pledges as pointing to around a 3-degree of warming compared to where we ideally need to get to, which is a 1.5 degrees. So the question is, well, how do you fill that gap? And that's what's going on right now, is to try and encourage greater ambition globally amongst countries around the world, but also amongst corporates as well. And so I think that's the big theme that we see, is there's a huge level of scrutiny now being applied to companies. And this morning, based from the UK perspective, the Treasury in the UK announced an initiative to require all listed companies and all large financial institutions to, from 2023, to start publishing clear transition plans. So this is effectively a requirement on listed companies to start publishing a clear plan of actually what does net zero mean for their organization and how are they actually going to achieve that. So that's really exciting too, I think, in terms of thinking about these requirements to push further ambition globally. The other key aspect from a corporate perspective has been around something called the Science-Based Targets Initiative, essentially a coalition of organizations to set the ground rules about how you calculate these science-based targets. Essentially, a science-based target here is a target that is aligned with the decarbonisation pathways that are necessary in order to limit global warming to this 1.5 degree goal. So what we see is a lot of these organizations globally setting these science-based targets and committing to the highest level of ambition, which is 1.5 degree pathway with the ultimate goal of getting towards net zero. And some of you might be asking, well, what does that really mean? Net zero is essentially, perhaps on the next slide, I might show this here. Net zero is essentially this final state here. So what we have here is total global CO2 emissions. And the key aspect here is that in order to have any chance of remaining on this 1.5 degree trajectory that you can see shown in this light blue line here, what we effectively need to do is to halve our global emissions by 2030. So significant challenge ahead in order to get there, and then to continue that long-term decarbonisation until we reach this sort of state of what we call residual emissions, which are emissions which are very hard to decarbonise any further, and then to use removals, essentially. So these are offsets in terms of investing in projects that take carbon out of the atmosphere and lock it away permanently. So the number of technologies and opportunities to do that are quite limited actually at the moment, but they are being scaled up over time to become available. So essentially, yes, the challenge is around reaching net zero. The challenge for most businesses now is not so much in setting the target, it's actually figuring out what the roadmap in terms of implementation should be in getting towards those reductions. So with that in mind, what I've got on the next few slides are some overviews of what we would see businesses need to take into consideration when they're setting these climate change strategies and roadmaps. I'm keeping an eye on the time as well. So 4 key areas really. So the first one being having a full detailed grasp of what the broader risks and opportunities are in terms of climate change. And so what we're talking about here is organizations understanding and moving beyond a simple view of well, how much impacts do we have on the atmosphere in terms of carbon, to a view which is actually climate change is going to have impacts on any organization, no matter what sector, specifically this alcohol sector, most definitely. And what are those impacts and how they're going to manifest themselves? So this is a view of how climate change will actually affect the financial viability of businesses. And that's really important, because what we can see also, again, from the COP in Glasgow this week, is a really strong message from the investment community that the financial services sector, this is pension funds, this is insurance community, are all looking to understand the long-term impacts of the finances and where they're invested. So it's actually following the money is a phrase that's been coined. So what this first pillar on the left about is understanding what those risks and opportunities are posed by climate change. And why is that important? It's important because investors are increasingly asking these questions of companies in which they invest into to understand what the long-term viability of that business is in relation to climate change. So climate change will have both physical impacts in terms of the global climate on a whole range of industries, agriculture and specifically when it comes to the alcohol sector. What are those impacts in terms of adverse impacts of crop yield, in terms of competition for feed ingredients in going into the alcohol industry with increased adverse effects of climate change, but also the advent of demand for biofuels and the price rises that will naturally be seen in the competition for crops. So the physical risks manifest themselves in many ways, and they eventually ultimately end up as a financial risk for companies, as well as the fact that hopefully from Glasgow and from global commitments, we'll see further action from governments to set hopefully a price on carbon and to start costing that effectively, which again has an impact on many businesses when you look at the operational viability of producing products. So we've heard earlier that alcohol, yes, it does have an energy intensive impact, and so the question there is obviously, well, what's the carbon pricing outlook on these businesses and how will they be affected over time? So first pillar there is really understanding what the broader contextual analysis of climate change risks and opportunities are. And the second pillar moving across is getting a full understanding of what the value chain emissions are. So this is essentially looking at beyond the four walls of a brewery or a distillery and saying, right, what have you accounted for the full end-to-end carbon impact of your products? So the speaker earlier had the BBC app there with the impact of beer and wine. Those are essentially life cycle impacts, and this second pillar across is a similar thing, but it's looking across the entire business activity. So it's looking at both product related emissions, so emissions related to the raw ingredients from an agricultural perspective, emissions associated with the packaging, if it's a glass bottle or it's an aluminium can or PET, what's the impact there? The manufacturing, the distribution through supply chains, through to whether this product needs to be chilled, to be enjoyed, etc., etc. So the value chain impact there of businesses is absolutely key for any business to develop a credible climate change policy. If they haven't measured the value chain impact, there's simply no hope of them developing a credible net zero strategy, because essentially when we're talking about net zero, it is net zero across the full end-to-end impact of the business, not just their own manufacturing emissions. So that's the second column there. Third one is the comprehensive and costed implementation plan. So again, key thing to look out for in terms of evaluating progress is not just whether they set a bold climate change commitment to reduce by 2030 or 2050, but actually have they gone to the effort of considering how they're going to get there? Have they looked at all of the energy efficiency opportunities across their sites? Have they considered the supply chain engagement aspects with farmers, with packaging suppliers, etc., with distribution and so on and so forth? So what opportunities have they looked for reduction there? And the last one there is around sort of advocating reduction in sectors beyond their own value chain as well. So what aspects says there, for many of these brands to use their brand voice around raising awareness of climate change and encouraging lower carbon lifestyles, either through labeling that we heard earlier as well, or other means. So that's the key four areas where we'd see any company, and specifically those companies in the drink sector, certainly need to be taking action and would be key criteria to evaluate a company's progress and the level of sincerity they have in terms of developing those climate change strategies. So take that one step further, just to cover off some of the jargon I've got at the top here. Scope 1 and 2, this is related to greenhouse gas protocol terminology. This is a worldwide accounting framework for accounting for greenhouse gas emissions. Scope 1 and 2 are essentially those emissions most commonly defined by their own operations. So these are emissions released into the atmosphere through the operation of their own assets. So this could be burning fossil fuels in a brewery or to produce their product, or a distillery, or it could be through burning of fuels and distribution of products as well. So essentially these are scope 1 and 2 emissions. So they're often the easier ones to measure because they'll have utilities bills on site, or they'll have clear information about how far their product has been transported, etc. So often they're referred to as the more manageable ones because they have direct influence over these. So key aspect here is, again, to what extent businesses are shifting away from this business as usual mentality to really get on track to align their targets with what's required to limit global warming to this 1.5. So this is a 1.5 trajectory requiring significant reduction and halving of emissions by 2030. So a whole range of aspects here around energy efficiency. So in breweries and distilleries, for example, here, not only in terms of improving the efficiency of operations, but looking at opportunities for heat recovery, looking at opportunities for on-site renewable energy, and reducing, certainly in some parts of the world where you have breweries powered by coal, for example. So looking at opportunities to shift away from high fossil fuel sourced energy to more renewable sources, or looking at long-term power purchase agreements for renewable electricity if they do not have sufficient space on site for renewable energy installations. And then you're broader than that, obviously looking at opportunities to look at electric vehicles for fleets, for hydrogen opportunities, and longer term transportation, through to fugitive emissions, as I said earlier, sort of looking at clean cooling as well, opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with refrigerant gases, and looking at energy management practices on chilling units as well. So some of the aspects there in terms of scope 1 and 2, which is typically manufacturing emissions or transportation if the organization owns their transport as well. Then broader than that, we have a range of opportunities to look at in terms of decarbonizing indirect emissions. And here, as you've guessed it, it's looking at upstream of the organization and the supply chain. What's the carbon impact of the raw materials from the agricultural sector? What opportunities are there for improving crop yields, for looking at climate smart agriculture, lessening the impacts of the need for pesticides, for mechanical equipment on farm, looking at a whole range there in terms of working with farmers. And then more broadly, looking at opportunities for product design in itself. So looking at the vessel that the beverage is served in. Is it glass? What percentage is recycled content with a lower embodied carbon emissions associated with that? Are you looking at aluminium cans? What's the impact there? Because aluminium typically has a high carbon impact from the production processes. Again, looking at opportunities for improving recyclate, lightweighting of product design, looking at alternative products entirely. So looking at lower carbon or lower alcohol products as well. What is the opportunity to innovate their businesses and capture that market? Through to ways of encouraging behavior change amongst consumers or citizens to understand their role in recycling the end beverage, or taking that back for a refill or whatever it might be. So whole aspect there. But again, what I was coming back to at the beginning with that second column that I was describing, unless organizations understand the full impact from purchase goods and services, everything they buy, transport, use phase, etc., unless they've done that full end-to-end analysis, then they don't have the data to inform decision making for product design, for procurement decisions, or for manufacturing energy efficiency opportunities. So that's really very much the sort of key step, because you then understand from this aspect, what are the opportunities for efficiency, for transportation, in terms of the product offering, in terms of supply chain as well. So I asked for a couple of case studies as well. So here's one from Carlsberg, who we've been working with to help them measure that value chain impact. So they've looked at developing some key targets here to look at reducing the emissions by 2022 for their value chain. They've made some good progress on that, still a way to go. And one key aspect here to draw out on the bottom left is the impact of across the value chain. So for Carlsberg, 40% of the impact is in the packaging. So in the glass bottle or the aluminium cans, and the question here is, how can they innovate those designs? How can they work with those suppliers? And they've done a lot of work with suppliers. They've worked with Ball Packaging, a large aluminium supplier, who've then gone on to look at how they can source lower carbon aluminium from renewable electricity sources and increase the amount of recycled aluminium going into their cans as well to further lower that. So a whole range of opportunities there. They've also looked at climate change risks and opportunities posed by extreme weather, shifting rainfall patterns on their aspects as well. So going back to what I was saying that well, there's 4 pillars earlier, those aspects in terms of understanding the risks and opportunities, understanding the value chain, setting some significant and ambitious targets, and then looking to ways that they can reduce that across their value chain. A smaller organization now, this is a small craft gin manufacturer based in London, who we've done some work with to help them do a number of things. So firstly, look at, again, the value chain model, value chain footprint rather, of all emissions across their business, to help them set targets to align to 1.5 degrees, to help them look at those key reduction measures, whether it's in their distillery or whether it's in the design of their bottles, and to look at broader opportunities to reduce emissions as far as they can on that journey as well. So, the key thing here again is around reductions, and I think the other aspect is a couple of other things I've wanted to mention. I think we're almost up to time, but within the drink sector specifically, packaging plays a really important role in terms of the carbon impact. Typically, the lower the carbon footprint of the contents, the higher the more important packaging becomes in terms of the carbon footprint there. So, that's quite significant for the drinks industry, more so than the food industry, where packaging impact tends to be smaller and you have far more significant impact on farm. So, milk, for example, having a high carbon impact there. So in terms of the drinks industry, when we look more broadly, and you mentioned alternatives earlier, the lowest footprint you can go is obviously water. But then, if you're packaging that water, the question there is, well, how are you doing that? How far is it transported? And then is it carbonated? Because if it is, you're going to have a higher carbon footprint because you've got stronger packaging requirements to keep that in place. So, there's a lot of trade-offs, I guess, when it comes to sort of packaging. And when you look more sort of broadly, other than water having a particularly low footprint, soft drinks, there's quite a large range of footprints there. Again, essentially, for some, decaffeinated or no sugar soft drinks, they're essentially got very, very similar footprint to bottled water, essentially. And the key aspect here is to consider, as you increase the sugar content or the juice content, all the way through to smoothies, you have a much, much higher carbon footprint, and sometimes higher than beer in some cases, because you've got a lot of agricultural emissions associated with that higher fruit content in the product as well. So when it comes to sort of the alcoholic drink sector, generally speaking, beer and cider have the lowest carbon footprint. But again, that varies hugely depending on packaging. To whether you're using draft beer in a pub, which is a typically lower or lowest carbon footprint when it comes to beer, through to consideration of higher carbon ways to enjoy beer through an aluminium can or a glass bottle. Again, the key question there is what's the percentage of recyclate in those beverage containers? Can they be taken back and refilled so that the precious materials can be recycled and put back into the system again? Followed through to wine, which typically have a higher carbon footprint. I saw your charts earlier. I think wine tends to have a higher carbon footprint in some cases than beer, depending on the method, all the way through to sort of spirits, which have some of the higher carbon footprints. And you mentioned earlier the sort of the glass bottles, obviously, and mentioning Scotch whiskey being transported on the road. Certainly, I think probably if they're looking at the highest carbon content for the drinks industry, it's probably going to be in those miniature bottles that you might have on a flight being flown around the world. essentially where you're you know, have a higher carbon content, and you're increasing the proportion of packaging, in the miniatures, you're going to have a higher carbon impact on those aspects there. So hopefully that gives you some sense of some of the work that the Carbon Trust does in terms of helping businesses to measure the broad impacts across their value chains, to look at product footprinting. We've done some work on product labeling as well, to try and you know, help to encourage consumers to understand where companies have made those commitments to reduce as well. But I think, you know, for some of your listeners, if I sort of sum up some of the key things to look out for in evaluating the drink sector, the key things would be, you know, have these a drink sector company looked at a broad range of risks and opportunities to their business. Have they measured the value chain emissions? Are they reporting on it in a transparent way year on year? Do they have credible plans to reduce those emissions all the way through to net zero? Are they on a science-based target trajectory to decarbonize their business as much as they can, not just buying offsets, but decarbonizing as much as they can, ideally by 50% by 2030? Yes, so I think that's some of the things I wanted to cover. So hopefully that's given some food for thought, and happy to answer questions.
There have been some criteria that have been developed by the food community. Has been a piece of work that's been led by the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, I think working in collaboration with a bit of the UN system. I want to say World Bank, I don't think it's World Bank. But anyway, they started off by wanting to develop a true cost accounting framework to measure the true value of food, which looked beyond just the carbon emissions, but then also looked at things like the impacts of a particular food or products on water, biodiversity, the social justice element, how workers are treated. I'll post a link into the chat actually to the original TEEB Agri framework. And initially that was really a broad economic assessment tool. But more recently, at the UN Food Systems Summit, there's been a recognition that actually this sort of approach should be adopted more broadly, and not just look at the economic impacts, but look at the whole impact of the food system, as it were. And so those criteria for the wider system, true value approach, are still being developed. It's a kind of a discussion that's currently live, and is going to be a follow-on from the summit, which was held in September. So it's a kind of, at this stage, watch this space. But I'll post a link to the original idea where this originated it started off in agri. There's been some thinking around it for labeling as well, but now people would like to apply it more broadly. And I would argue it'd be quite useful to have a similar approach adopted to the alcohol sector, as this thinking is happening for food.
I think that what we need to see across government institutions, and that includes the European Commission, is policy coherence. So we have on the one hand DG Santé saying that alcohol consumption should be reduced. There's no safe level of drinking because of the risk with alcohol and cancer. And that less is better. But then on the other hand, we have DG Agri and other departments that subsidise the production of alcohol as an agricultural product, and also subsidise the marketing and promotion of alcohol as an agricultural product. And I know that Eurocare has done some really excellent campaigning around that. So I think we need to first of all address the inconsistencies. And I think that we also need to I suppose, have a bit of a reality check in understanding the different policy settings within which we're working, and know the importance of wine production, for example, and beer production as an agricultural, valuable commodity within the European system. So recognising that, so seeing what levers could be pulled. And I think that some of the criteria that Modi and Tom have outlined about how companies could do better, the transparent reporting of full value chain impacts on carbon emissions, on water usage, will really lend itself to better policy coherence, because the EU also wants to be a green region, and it has its own climate change targets and ambitions, as do other regions and countries within the world. So I suppose it's, yeah, the big answer to the big question is around policy coherence and the need for us as NGOs and pressure groups to work outside of our silos and work in partnership with other sectors. So we'll be calling for that. I don't know if Modi or wanted to come in and say anything in addition, or Tom.
Yeah, just to say, I absolutely agree with you, Catherine. It is just about policy coherence. And we have the same problem in the UK. And on the one hand, you've got, the targets for safe alcohol consumption, which are being exceeded. And on the other hand, you've got subsidies for alcohol production and marketing. It's one of our top 10 exports from the UK, along with other unsustainable things like meat products. And so, yeah, if we had policy coherence as a minimum, you wouldn't have subsidies for alcohol production for exports to other markets. And if we wanted to subsidize a bit of the food and drink system, then perhaps those investments could go into the sorts of foods everyone needs to be eating more of around the world. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's the main tool, policy coherence, which currently isn't happening. Occasionally different groups call for it, but then perhaps we should all start calling for it all the time, consistently across the board, for it to eventually just become the norm, which it currently isn't.
And Tom, did you have anything further to add?
Not specifically on that. I mean, the main challenge I think for any business is when they're doing this evaluation and setting net zero targets is they'll measure their footprint in year one, and the big question is, well, what does their marketing team say they're going to do in year 3, year 4, year 5? What's their sales? So when you look at these environmental strategies and you read on one side the annual report, which says here's our strategy about how we're going to grow our business, et cetera, and then you read the sustainability report, do they feel like they're written by two completely different organizations, or actually is there some synergy between the two? Ultimately, businesses will seek to grow. The big question here is, can they decouple that growth with their environmental impacts, I think, from our perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. I think it's excellent, and I definitely share those concerns about the potential unintended consequences of labelling. I mean, looking at that case study from, is it Alvalin, the small alcohol company, the fact that they were including charitable donations as part of one of the things they were including in this environmentally sustainable label, immediately warning bells kind of went off. And I mean, but then also more broadly across the piece, and this applies to other food products as well, there can often be conflicts between, something that's good for the environment versus something that's good for health. So Coca-Cola is one example where sugar growing has very low, carbon emissions. And so products high in sugar would end up with all green labels on the environment side and all reds on the health side. And so then, you've got these competing things, and what should the customer do? Or consumer or citizen do? And so, these are kind of, I guess, bigger questions we need to ask ourselves, and they haven't been tested. Do we need one integrated label that takes into a true value approach where the health and the environment are combined? What might be the impacts of that? Should we have them separately? Just also going back to the Alvalin case study, the evidence on labelling clearly shows that traffic light simplified approaches are much more accessible to consumers. It's interesting, they've gone for a nutrition facts approach, which is all these numbers that 50% of people apparently in the UK can't read percentages. So then you do wonder, if they are genuinely wanting to support the consumer, why are they going for a more complicated form of labelling compared to the more simplified one? So I just think, although in general I am definitely pro-transparency, but I don't know. I think personally I see labelling as a potentially double-edged sword, and seems like some of the people on in the chat also agree. So yeah, we need to carefully watch and see what happens, and do more research to work out what is best in this space.
And just to follow up, I would agree with everything that Modi just said. I think that what we'd want to see is a level playing field whereby all producers were subject to the same criteria for things on their label, so that consumers had, a level playing field of information as well.
I think the question around sort of the provenance is a tricky one, isn't it? Because I think food and drink such an emotive topic. People have sort of such an emotional attachment to their dietary choices and drink choices as well. So I think it's a difficult one to sort of overcome that. And you know, politicians have shown that they're not really willing to go there in terms of telling us what we should eat or drink either, right? So I think that's the challenge there. So as for the carbon impact of it, I think yeah, there is some opportunity there when you look at carbon perspective. Obviously, transportation does have an impact on the carbon footprint of these products, and shipping them around the world is you know, the big question is, well, how are they getting there? Can they go shipping routes with maybe lower carbon than trucking, or what are the other options from an innovation perspective in the future? And can they go in bulk containers rather than individual units, which would then help to reduce the packaging impact as well, and be packaged closer to the market is another option there. As for the question around you know, not drinking alcohol and sort of making the alignment with lower carbon living, and sort of then yeah, certainly there's the aspect there. And I think, you know, there's maybe there's I think a number of sort of environmental groups sort of point to that, and I've seen a couple of articles online pointing to that as well, in terms of, you know, one less beer and these sorts of things. So I think that there's action there, but it's similar to many of our aspects of our life cycle, right? We all consume products, so you know, you can take that analogy to any aspect really, in terms of, you know, not getting on the flight to go for your holiday. And so it's a question, I think, of sort of considering these things in terms of context. And I think that's the challenge with labeling, right? You mentioned this earlier, you know, putting a percentage value or a carbon figure on a product isn't necessarily valuable unless the citizen understands the full remit of their lifestyle choices. So I think, you know, there's that question, I'm coming back to the labeling thing aspect, is labeling certainly will help, but I think there's a bigger role here for sort of for corporates to play in terms of talking about the broader impacts of their products in relation to other aspects of our lifestyles, and also for schools and education in a big way as well, to talk about, you know, the sort of the carbon embodied in everything that we consume, and to provide broader education that way. It would be great to have had that at an earlier stage of my education. I know that much, but yeah.
I think the only thing I would sum up, you know, your premise is that we just need to consume less for the sake of the planet. And if we all did that, the world would be a better place. So that's what we should all aim to do. And companies should just also aim to sell less in general.